Globalization has brought many good things. It has increased economic output for many countries. It brings information to us faster than ever. And overall, it just increased our standards of living. But it also has its complications and problems, especially when it comes to developing countries. Developing countries do not have a strong rule of law as some developed countries do, which makes it difficult for them to adjust to globalization and especially to financial globalization. There are three things that I'm going to focus on today. First is corruption, and then how growth is measured, and also natural resources. When the North American Free Trade Agreement was accepted and it started being used, the results were not as good as Mexico was hoping. After much study, they realized that one of the reasons that the NAFTA was not as effective, it was because of the corruption in Mexico. The government was just not ready for the trade that was going to come in. It was not, the institutions were not strong enough. Another example of this was in Colombia. In Colombia, they were also negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. But there were some problems there. The International Trade Union Confederation reported that in 2012, at least 18 union leaders were killed and 359 received death threats. Now, this is very complicated. This is a labor rights situation. So what the United States did, they required Colombia to show that they were trying to control the situation. They were trying to better the situation for the union leaders. So they made Colombia wait for the free trade agreement to be passed. So this is an example of a developed country using its influence to better a developing country. Now, for growth, growth has usually been measured in gross domestic product, which is the amount of goods and services a country produces in a year. But as we all know, the way a person is living is not just determined by how much a country is producing. It also depends on their education, on their health, and then on their economic level. So a better way to measure growth is the Human Development Index because it contains health, education, and economic output. So if in the news, instead of saying the economy grew by 5%, we would hear the economy, the health, and the education of the people improved by this much in a given year. People would be better informed about what was going on in their country. There would be different expectations. If, for example, the health and the education were not doing as well as people had hoped, people could stand up to their politicians and ask for better results. The other problem that developing nations face in this globalization is the natural resources. One of those examples was in Ecuador. Martin Core from a research center, as a research center director, pointed out that Chevron wasted 345 million gallons of crude oil and 18.5 billion gallons of toxic waste in the Amazon forest of Ecuador. This created many illnesses and even deaths among the native population. Now, you may think, how was this allowed? Well, as I mentioned before, the rule of law in these countries is not as strong. So the enforcement of the law was not good, and they were not aware that Chevron was doing these things, and therefore all these things happened, and it wasn't until later that the government said, okay, there are things that are happening here, and then the natives were, asking for the government to do something about it. So I touched on corruption, on how growth is being measured, and on natural resources. Now, you may think, is this a problem of the developed nations? Not necessarily, but it does affect everyone in the end. You may not see it directly, but if the developing nations are doing better, it also affects the developed nations. For example, one of the issues is migration. If, for example, Mexico was doing better economically, people wouldn't feel the need to go somewhere else. In the same case, we could speak about many other countries. We could even speak about the situation in Syria. Now, Syria, of course, is more of a civil war situation, but it all starts on how that population is doing. If there's a stability in the developing world, there's also stability in the developed world. That's why it is beneficial that we're all on the same page and that we all bring stability for everyone and not just ourselves. Globalization has affected countries in a way that we were not expecting. Globalization makes us all dependent on one another. It is not as easy to just think, okay, now we're in a little corner of the world and everyone else can figure it out for themselves. It is not that simple. I was living in Argentina for 2 years, and in Argentina, they decided that they didn't want trade as much anymore. They decided that they were going to restrict trade. Well, what they didn't realize was that this created inflation. And I would see it every time I would go to the bank. I would just get less and less money each time. And this affected not just me, but everyone living there. And now think about all those Argentines there. They probably thought, well, I could just go somewhere else. I could take all my hard earned money and leave because it is just not as good here. So that is why I want you all to think, how is my government acting in the situation? Are we acting in a way that we're making everyone better off, or are we being selfish and then in return making ourselves worse off?